Hi, my name is Nicola, and we are going to be doing a quick discussion about the digital divide, digital literacy, and digital fluency. So let me get started. Okay, so the digital divide, digital literacy, and digital fluency. So what we're going to be discussing here is giving a definition for what is digital literacy, giving a definition for what is the digital divide, digital fluency. What is the digital divide? What are the pros and the positives of digital fluency within a classroom, particularly an English classroom? And then finally, the cons. What are the negative sides or the problematic sides of having digital fluency in an English FET classroom? At the end of the slide, there is a reference list in case you want to go look through any of the references that I have used for these slides. So the first question is what is digital literacy? And the reason why I'm starting with digital literacy is digital literacy and digital fluency need to be understood before we understand what the digital divide is. So we're going to start with this definition and then move through towards the other sections because there is a reason and there's a plan that I have. So just keep following me. So what is digital literacy? Digital literacy is a set of skills that an individual has. And digital literacy is actually, well, more arguably something that most people have access to. They are somewhat familiar with digital devices, mostly things like smartphones. They're comfortable with things like social media, entry-level websites, and most apps that they can access. They're able to find, basic information using Google. They are aware of how to use Google on a very superficial level, none of the sort of nuanced settings. They are able to generate a certain amount of media, in other words, like short films or edited pictures, texts, tweets, posts on various levels that they can create for social media, and generally that's where the skill set starts from. They are often not comfortable, however, when it comes to things like laptops or desktops. And the reason for that is just the lack of skill set. Most people who are digitally literate grow up using a small screen like a tablet or a phone, but not necessarily a laptop or a desktop. They might never have seen one, and they certainly probably have not used one. And the moment you start dealing with programs that are slightly more complex, like Word or PowerPoint, and then obviously the more complicated ones after that, like Excel, things tend to go slightly more awry because these programs suddenly make them realize how little skills they actually do have. So there is often a lack of skill set when it comes to working programs that are aimed for the workplace or tertiary education. There is one of the big problems that kind of leads into is the fact that, or has started from, is that most people who are digitally literate are sort of self-taught. And what I mean by self-taught is that this was information that they have gained through their own initiatives, their own interest levels, access to their own devices. This is not something that was usually taught to them in a formal manner. And so digital literacy is usually something that has come from their own curiosity. They're self-taught most of the time, rather than having somebody sit down and say, okay, this is Word, this is how it's working. And another big problem that we tend to find with people that are digitally literate is that digital literacy does not extend to critical thinking. And what I mean by that is that people can assess information or they can access information, but they can't look at information and assess whether it is accurate, correct, or not. Often you will find that they will be assessing information and it will be completely irrelevant or maybe not accurate because it is possibly fake news or it has been spread with malicious intent, or perhaps it was just a complete misinformation piece that was produced too early or the facts hadn't been released yet. And a lot of the time people who are digitally literate aren't able to sort of unpack and go through the various sources because they tend to go click on the first link and that's what they end up with. So having said that, what is digital fluency? And I want to think about the difference between the words literacy and fluency. Literacy is the ability to use a set of skills and communicate using those skills. Fluency indicates, on a very sort of superficial level, a level of comfortability with a language or a skill. And that's obviously the big difference between the two. Being digitally literate means you know how to use the basic resources you are given in terms of technology, but being digitally fluent means that you are comfortable with technology. You are able to do certain things. So, for example, here they're able to use websites like Google Scholar with confidence. Now, the reason I say that is when you start working with students in sort of high school ages and university, if you start asking things like, do you guys know what Google Scholar is? You usually get a whole lot of blank expressions. And this is because they just do not know what Google Scholar is. They've never been exposed to it. And without that exposure, they're not going to find it. Google Scholar is not something you accidentally fall upon in your studies. Somebody needs to show you. They do not have the ability to discern between which information is valid and which is fact-checked and which is not. So false news tends to proliferate with the digitally literate, but not necessarily the digitally fluent, because the digitally fluent can look at a picture and go, that's been edited. Or they can look at a video and go, I can see where that has been edited on Photoshop or any of those programs. Whereas somebody who is not digitally fluent and has not got the sort of comfortability with the technology that is being used, they are going to be so surprised by it and so amazed by it that the idea that it's real or not doesn't often cross their mind. A lot of the time, people who are digitally fluent are very comfortable with devices. They can probably easily different devices. They can swap between operating systems like Android versus Apple. And they are often able to use programs that are more complex like Excel. If not even Excel, I use it as a baseline a suggestion for a program that can be somewhat complicated, if not necessarily the most difficult. And then lastly, people who are somewhat digitally fluent can troubleshoot to a certain extent. And what that means is that they can be presented a set of issues, they can look at it and go, okay, no, I see what the problem is, this is how we fix it. Or if they don't know the solution themselves, they're fairly good at finding that information out, and they will find somebody with the skills. For example, somebody who is an actual IT tech support person, they will ask them to take them through the steps, and they can follow those steps because they know what they're looking for. Whereas somebody who's digitally literate, for example, resetting an IP address, that is not something somebody who is not digitally fluent is going to be able to do. Something that I want to start off with before I start talking about the digital divide is that most of our learners in South Africa are digitally literate. And we say that, and I say that not assuming that every person has a phone, but you will find that majority of the kids, particularly learners that are in environments like schools and in urban settings, they are going to have access to some form of technology. Often that technology will be a smartphone or a tablet or something similar to that. They will have experience with it. They will know what to do. They will know how to work DSTV for the most part. But that does not mean that they are digitally fluent. And a lot of the time, your learners will not know the difference between the two. And that is something quite important to think about, because just because someone is digitally literate doesn't mean they're fluent. And the assumption that you can be fluent and that anybody is fluent because they know how to use a phone does not really translate to other pieces of technology. So what is our digital divide? And the digital divide is the difference or the gap between being digitally literate and digitally fluent. And what this comes down to basically is how they have learned this information, how they've applied this information, and how they are using this information and these skills in the future. So the first problem is that, as I said, there is a lot of technical know-how that is missing from being digitally literate to digitally fluent. If you are digitally literate, you know how to hard reset a phone. You might know how to put factory settings back to normal, but you probably won't be able to know how to do some more complex, like actually break down the programming of a phone. Now, that's not saying that everybody who is digitally fluent can do so, but they are probably able to navigate the settings and the more complex aspects of a phone than somebody who is just digitally literate. The next thing that you'll find is that learners that are not digitally literate, again, they will often find articles and they'll just believe them on the internet without really assessing whether they're fact-checked and accurate. Particularly when news is spread around on things like social media, and there is a big campaign on Facebook at the moment to move towards making sure that all information is held accountable. However, this is quite difficult to do when you have a problem or a massive gap between those who know how to fact check something and people who just assume things are information and they are valid just because they're coming from a specific source. And then lastly, learners who are digitally literate will often be able to make the jump into places like tertiary education and the workplace. That is because they assume they know how to work a phone, therefore that translates onto a computer, and that is not often the case. You will often find your learners, the moment you present them with something like a Word document or an Excel document, they are going to be flummoxed on how to use that. They are incredibly effective at communicating on things like WhatsApp, and they are incredibly effective at using things like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. But the moment you put them onto a different realm where the aim is not to share a post or create a post, but rather to create something for a workplace like a spreadsheet or a table, they're going to get lost. And that just means that there's a skill set that can easily be acquired but is missing currently. So is there any good things to being digitally fluent in a classroom? And why do we use it for English particularly? Well, the first thing that I'm going to say is that English can be and is often considered a very dry, very boring subject. And by being digitally fluent, we can make the classroom a lot more fun. So the first thing that it does is it opens up a whole lot of resources for both the educators and the learner. The first is that you can have things like online dictionaries that are far easier to use than spending hours paging through the book that might not have the word because it's such an old dictionary. Or they might have access to things like translators that they might not have access to in a classroom. They might not have those bilingual dictionaries, or the bilingual dictionary is too short and doesn't incorporate all the sufficient wording that is required. That also leads into the teacher being able to use fun resources. So educators a lot of the time will use the internet to get inspiration. And this is quite important because educators, particularly those who have been teaching for several years, it's easy to get dispirited and it's easy to get bored and it's easy to use the same worksheet that you have used for the last 10 years. And the big shift here is that if you are digitally fluent, you know how to find new resources that can inspire you. That is not to say you will use the exact resources that have been created already online, but you definitely will get an idea on how to create your own that might be similar or might be different. This obviously will work for things that are not just worksheets, but being digitally fluent allows us to use certain amounts of tech. It allows us to use PowerPoint, it allows us to use smartboards. It allows us to use videos and on YouTube or play audio clips from audiobooks. It allows us to have access to information that we may not have found before. The other thing that we can do is we can get learners to do their own research, whether that's at class and in class during our periods and they use the library, or whether we are using that as an opportunity for them to go home and do extra research. It does allow them, it allows us to put in their court and expect them to go do the research for themselves. And then finally, learners will be equipped with a whole lot of skills that they are going to need, whether in an academic future or in a workplace. If our learners don't know how to use basic programs like Microsoft Word, Excel, or PowerPoint, they are going to find it very difficult to function in the workplace, and they're going to find it difficult on how to engage with that tertiary education. Universities will not accept handwritten documents anymore. You have to submit a physically typed up document. And if you do not have access to something, if you cannot submit on SafeAssign and know how to submit a document and upload a document, you can't submit your assignments. And so our classrooms need to be able to teach them these skills without necessarily bombarding them with the information. But as always, with a pro comes a con. What are the negatives? What are the problematic sides to digital fluency? Digital fluency has some negative things that can happen in a classroom. And I mean, I say this as a bit of a joke because obviously you can see that and you can hear that I'm somebody who is very pro being digitally fluent, but there are things that can go wrong. The first I'm going to say is that there are the dangers of the internet. The internet is often considered an incredibly wonderful creation, but there are some scary things that happen on there. And sometimes our learners don't know how to stay away from certain things. They don't know what is dangerous. They don't know what they're doing. And therefore, they end up in a situation where they can be taken advantage of, even if it seems to be innocent at the moment. And something we need to be aware of is making sure that they are aware of what the dangers of the internet are. We're not trying to make them afraid. We're just not letting them go into the environment and be completely innocent and naive. Something else that happens that's more of a danger for us is often plagiarism, particularly in a subject like English. As an English teacher, we will often be expecting them to write essays or create documents, and if we we say to them, okay, go and type it up for us, it is very easy for them to just be like, oh, I'll find this topic on the internet, copy and paste. And there are actually people that get paid to write student assignments now, and high school assignments. And there is a big conversation about how is that morally okay and how is that not problematic. And so there is a big move towards assessing things like plagiarism, making sure that we have programs that can avoid this sort of thing, and generally just being aware of our learners' capabilities are. The other thing is fake news. Fake news and misinformation is very problematic in today's day and age. It allows things like COVID to spread, and it allows situations to arise that people misunderstand how the disease works, and so they might be doing problematic things like taking the wrong medicine or doing things that could actually make the disease spread faster and worse. Misinformation around something like COVID has been exactly one of the most things to watch, is what people actually understand by virus and what they understand by what a virus does, and the stigmatism that gets associated with if you've caught the disease, even though there has been, for the most part, no lasting effect on most people that have caught it and then recovered. So what is the other side of the coin? The other side of this is that by implementing digital literacy and digital fluency in a classroom, we are increasing the digital divide in a society like South Africa. By giving some learners access to this, we are highlighting the fact that there will be learners who will not have access to these opportunities. And as I've said here, access equals opportunity. If you do not have access to something, you are less likely to have the opportunity to use it in future and acquire that skill and develop that skill further. So if somebody comes to a job interview and they say, I've never worked on a computer before, versus somebody who has worked on a computer before, the likelihood of you employing the person who has the skills versus the person who has no skills and you have to train up is very high. So you need to really assess for yourself whether you are going to engage with this information and how you're going to engage with this information and how we are going to present digital fluency and engage with it in a classroom, because we don't want the classroom to be a space where there is inequality. So the big question is how do we decide who gets and who does not? Every class and every school will have certain limited numbers of access, and that also means to who has access to it after class and in the afternoons versus who does not. And we have to be very aware as educators that if we are asking them to do an activity that requires research, we cannot expect everyone to be able to bring the same type of research to us if we know our learners do not have the same resources at home. And we need to make sure that we are giving them as many opportunities as possible without hindering them because they do not have the access and resources required to complete a task. And that is everything about digital literacy and the digital divide. So here are my references, and that is it. Thank you very much.